digital and green recovery. And in this panel, we will have an amazing list of speakers and panelists that will give their own views and their own takes on these issues, specifically focusing on the themes of digital and green in this process of the structural transition and recovery. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. We will have Werner Stengg, who's working with the European Commission. Is currently an expert on the cabinet of the Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, and is working on digital issues. Before this, he's been between 2006 and 2019. He's been heading different units within the European Commission, dealing with different dimensions of the digital industry, dealing specifically with e-commerce, online platforms, public interest services, online gambling, postal services, and with a better regulation agenda, with the policy and regulatory side of these issues. And interestingly, to our aims, given that part of the workshop is also on evaluations and impact evaluations and the effectiveness and the evidence on what works and what does not work, before he's been involved in mainstreaming and making possible that evaluation and policy evaluation became a central objective of the activities of the European Commission. Has been leading and mainstreaming policy evaluations in issues as different as the negotiation of bilateral and multilateral textile trade agreements, and the areas of aviation and maritime transport and so on. He also holds a PhD in economics from Vienna University. So welcome, Werner. And let me introduce the two additional speakers that we have. After Werner, Elena Verdolini will speak. She's a professor in political economy at the University of Brescia in Italy. And she's also a senior scientist at the European Institute on Economics and the Environment. And he's been working on various pieces of research, essentially with an applied focus on issues related to the dynamics of innovation, technology transfer, green growth, and the economic impact of environmental and energy policies. And importantly, to our aims, she's the principal investigator of a big 5-year European Council Research Council grant called, with a nice acronym, 2D4D, which stands for Disruptive Digitalization for Decarbonization. So really tackling the issue of digital together with the issue of the environment and the environmental transition. And during the project that she's beginning, and that it is beginning now, she'll be looking at issues related to the energy and socio-economic implications of various key digital technologies, essentially in three main sectors: industry, transportation, and building and construction, which are typically hard to decarbonize. So it's going to be a great challenge for the project that she leads. And finally, last but not the least, Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, who's Princesa de Asturias Chair and a professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics. He's the director of the Cañada Blanche Center at LSE. He was the head of the Department of Geography and the Environment during 2006 and 2009. And he is the author, widely quoted, of a number of papers on local development, cohesion policies, geography, economic geography and business, and much more than that. So welcome, Andrés, and thank you for being with us today. So the rules of the game is that each of the speakers will have 20 minutes. And then we'll gather the different questions and remarks from the audience and from ourselves. and have about half an hour to discuss the main results. So Werner, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Very pleased to be here in this illustrious round of people. I am not a cohesion expert, as you rightly suggested in your introduction, but I'm a digital expert. But as you will soon find out, I'm deeply convinced that the digital transformation without a strong focus on cohesion in the widest possible sense of the word is not going to work. Now, the title of my introduction here is the EU path towards a human-centric and inclusive digital and green transition. It's a very long title, contains lots of important words, each of them counts. It's also a very ambitious policy that is behind that. As much as the objectives pursued are very ambitious, also the policy behind it is quite impressive, I must say, after 25 years of experience in the European institutions. We have set ourselves, we being Europe, we have set ourselves ambitious goals, both for the digital and the green transitions, as you well know, which we call the twin transition. And that was already sort of the most important element of the work program of the von der Leyen Commission when we took office, well before COVID happened, right? So she went out and said, twin transition, that is what we need in Europe. And that's also why already after a couple of months, only 2-3 months maximum, we came with the first deliverables in that area. We had the Green Deal communication that you all certainly have seen. On the other hand, we came out with a digital policy package. That was a white paper on artificial intelligence. There was a complicated data strategy, and also an overarching digital strategy paper, which we had called Shaping Europe's Digital Future. And that's important in terms of language. We said shape. The ambition is that we can shape the digital transition in line with Europe's values and beliefs. So it's not just that we constantly have to adapt to this, right? To run behind the technological developments, run behind the GAFA and their business models and their impact on our societies. But we deeply believe it is both necessary and possible to shape this process in a way that works for Europe and works for each and every one of us. And that's where cohesion already comes in for the first time. Then came the pandemic, just after 4 months in office. And in terms of digital transition, we have all seen how much this has accelerated digitization in all aspects of life, right? When nothing else worked anymore, selling and buying online worked. When we couldn't send our kids to school, we teleschooled them. When we need to communicate or work from distance, we all got familiar very fast with all sorts of communication tools, which by now I think we all master without much difficulty. But I guess everybody on this call will have forgotten to unmute themselves on numerous occasions. Anyway, a huge acceleration of anything digital. But that also makes it even more important that this digital transformation takes place in the most inclusive manner possible. Because if we all depend on digital more than ever before, if you're then not digital, I mean, where are you then as a business, as a citizen? So we need to empower all citizens. We need to empower all companies. Also companies, whatever they do, whatever size they may have, wherever they may be established, geographically speaking. So big effort to make sure that everybody is on board. The pandemic has a positive side effect, if there is anything positive about a pandemic with all its drastic consequences, also meant that more money has been made available for the green and the digital transitions. You have already discussed this morning, I think, the Recovery and Resilience Facility and the enormous amount of money that has gone into this. And you also know that each of the national plans has to include at least 37% of expenditure on climate investments and 20% at least on the digital transition. And what we have seen so far, I think usually goes beyond those numbers. I remember before pandemic, we already discussed the multi-annual, spending program, multi-annual financial framework, with little progress. And what member states usually sacrifice first is the more innovative pieces, because we had already proposed a lot more money going into digital, into artificial intelligence, into data, into what have you. But in the very first stages of the negotiations, everybody said, no, we need to have agriculture, we need to have regional funds, we need to have this, that, and the other. And they started cutting on all the forward, future-looking things. But with COVID, that changed. The dynamics changed totally, and that is why both in the EU budget, as much as in this additional recovery and resilience facility, this accent was put on forward-looking investments into green and digital. Obviously, the main idea is that we should invest in our future and not in restoring the past. I think there was a learning from the financial crisis, when also a lot of money was used to get us out of the financial crisis 10 years ago, a bit more even. But it was more to restore existing structures. And now we said, no, if we borrow so much money from our children, we had better invest it in a way that will improve their lives, right? So as a result of all of these developments, political, financial, and so on, we have now in the meantime, of course, made our initial strategies more operational. On the green side, we have adopted the Fit for 55 package, which is being, of course, negotiated as we speak. And on the digital side, we adopted the Digital Decade Policy Program, terrible name, which is also why we subtitled it as the path to the digital decade, because we are saying this is now the decade for Europe, really to take off in terms of digital transformation. And there is a clear path towards achieving our objectives that we have set ourselves for 2030. So there's a clear direction of travel. It is, of course, also important to note that the green and the digital transitions are very much interlinked. It is clear that digital technologies are key enablers for the green transition. If we're all thinking about making our economies more efficient, how would you do that without the intelligent use of data and artificial intelligence? Talking about energy grids and making sure that demand and supply are combined in the most efficient way. If you talk about efficiency of buildings, all the energy that we use in buildings, often for nothing. If we want to improve mobility solutions. So there's so many inefficiencies in our economy with a huge carbon footprint that if technology is used in an intelligent way, that's one of the most promising avenues for major progress. Of course, at the same time, we all know that digital technologies themselves are huge consumers of energy. So also the energy footprint, carbon footprint of all those data centers and so on must become more sustainable. But anyway, digital and green are called twin transition for a reason. For this transition to work, we on the one hand, of course, need to coordinate all this investment, which will, as I said, come from different sources. It will come from the EU budget, it will come from national budgets, it will come from private sources. So we need a very intelligent mechanism, of course, to make sure that we know that this money is spent in the most intelligent way, that it is spent in a way that public funding doesn't crowd out private funding. It is spent in a way that where member states can go together because there are cross-border issues to be solved, that we find effective mechanisms for such cross-border investments. We call them multi-country projects in the Digital Decade Policy Program. If you're talking about 5G corridors, for instance, well, it's quite obvious that the corridor doesn't stop at the border of Austria and Italy. So a lot of cooperation is needed. But in addition to all this financial engineering that is needed, we also need an adequate legislative framework. And that is probably what we're doing also, especially in my area in digital, very much so, because in the heading of my intervention, I refer to human-centric and inclusive approach. Human-centric meaning that technology should serve the people and not the other way around. That we are not just the donors of data in a digital economy, but that we are that we are in greater control over our data, that we are not only protected but also empowered in this digital world. And for this, we need, of course, a legislative framework, which we've also proposed in the meantime: Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, Artificial Intelligence Act, and a few others, Data Governance Act, all to make sure that as this digital transformation moves forward, it respects our rights, it respects our values, it respects our basic understanding of democracy, for instance, that it is not very, very large companies that should decide on all of our behalf, who is the winner and who is the loser of the digital transition, but that this is a democratically controlled process. So this is the legislative angle. And as I said, inclusive obviously means that no one is left behind. And that can mean for social reasons. Think about schooling. Yeah, I mentioned this before. I mean, of course, if you're well off and have 3 iPads and 2 desktops at home and a wonderful Wi-Fi connection, and if you're digital literate as a parent as well, you can probably help your kids through this homeschooling period. But if you have none of this, if you're socially, if you're poorer, not well educated, if you have no equipment at home, no good connectivity, I mean, you're already leaving behind 25%, 30% of all kids out there. So there's some quite horrifying statistics in terms of pupils being left out, because gender-related issues, age-related issues. My mother is 77 years old, lives in the Austrian mountains, has never used a computer in her life, and I'm not sure she will ever start doing so. What if everything goes online even more, if all governmental services are provided almost exclusively electronically, as you would see in Denmark, for instance, or in other places, Estonia? I'm not quite sure how my mother would cope with this. And then, of course, geography, but that's the same. Actually, my mother also lives in a very rural and mountainous area with all the beauties and all the downsides, as we know. So how can we make sure this wonderful digital transformation doesn't leave anybody behind? Now, this Digital Decade Policy Program, which was adopted only a bit more than a week ago, actually, was setting clear targets to be reached by 2030. That's also where evaluation already kicks in, right? You're setting yourself, you identify problems, you're setting yourself targets, and then comes the monitoring progress. And in my experience as an evaluator in my previous part of a career, that was usually the part that was neglected. We've always been grand in setting out, fantastic objectives, and then, nobody was really double checking if and why and how this worked and how corrective action could be taken. Probably some of you still remember the Lisbon process. Years ago, we said by 2020, I think it was, we will be the most competitive region in the world. And then, yes, but there was no program, there was no monitoring, there was nothing really supporting this claim. So we quickly had to invent other strategies to make the old one forgotten. That's not supposed to happen again. So we have set clear targets in areas that are also fully coherent with the RRF framework, with digital skills, infrastructures, from connectivity to cloud, from microprocessors to high performance computing. Then thirdly, the digital transformation of businesses, both the innovative startups, but also any normal SME that may be lagging behind in terms of take-up of new technologies. And also then fourthly, the digital transformation of the public sector, very much to the benefit of businesses and citizens. But as I said, setting ambitious targets, and we did set ambitious targets in these documents, is not enough. We must somehow ensure that there's a fair chance of achieving these targets on the ground. And therefore, most of the Digital Decade Program decision, actually in legal terms, is about a tight governance and monitoring framework. So there's a fairly elaborate annual reporting and cooperation mechanism, iterations between the Commission and member states, reporting, discussions, identifying where we may not, or member states, or we collectively may not be on track, what can be done about it, taking corrective actions. So constantly keep that strategy alive and improve it if improvement is what is needed. Now, in those targets, the cohesion elements, the digital divide threat is firmly embedded. And I said already on skills, it's not just, you know, ICT skills or top ICT skills. It's that, but it's also basic skills for everybody in our society and everybody in our workforce. When we set targets for businesses, as I said, it is not only for the innovative startups, it's also for the rest of the economy. And then, of course, when it comes to connectivity and other infrastructure objectives, also there, the objective is that everybody is involved. Now, this annual monitoring framework will, just to conclude in the last few minutes, will not just be limited to checking progress to these 2030 targets. It will also extend to what we call digital principles. That's what we had already announced a few months back in this digital decade communication. We said on the one hand, we will set targets, 2030 targets that I just described. On the other hand, we want citizens to be the beneficiaries from the digital transformation. And we are working towards an interinstitutional declaration on those digital principles by European Parliament, by the Council of Ministers, by the European Commission, where we're sort of laying out where we want citizens, European citizens, to be by 2030, both in terms of rights, but also in terms of empowerment. So rights would, of course, be that in the online world, our rights are as much protected as they are in the offline world, from privacy to other issues, but also empowerment, that we actually, that digital technologies work for us, that we receive first-class connectivity, that we have access to first-class education, including digital, to healthcare services, to public services in the most efficient way, and so on and so forth. So that will also be monitored through the process that I have described. Now, to sum up my intervention, first of all, with this digital and green transition, I think we are confronted with challenges of an unprecedented scale. I mean, the effort that is needed to cope with both these challenges, in particular during and after fighting a pandemic on top of everything, that's a major challenge. So there's no doubt about this. But I think so is our policy response. I'm not aware of any period in time, at least during my time in the Commission, that so much money has been mobilized to address such challenges, both at the EU and the national level, that there was so much alignment as to the direction of travel. What are the goals? Where would we want to be in 10 years from now, both in green and in digital? So there's never been so much political will to make this work, both on spending and on legislation, when we launched, as I said before, major global reforms of the internet. That was unthinkable 5 years ago when I was already working on those issues. So the platform regulations and the technology regulations, we are setting global standards. We are being watched with great interest, potentially also some fear from other parts of the planet. So the political will is there, the money is there, the strategy is there. Well, and by 2030 at the latest, we will know whether we are as good in implementing our plans as in devising them in the first place. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Werner. Very insightful presentation. I like the your emphasis on rights and democracy and empowerment and what this entails for the digital transition, the twin transition, as you call it. Let me give the floor to Elena Verdolini, please. Elena, the floor is yours. You have about 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. I have prepared a few slides to guide my presentation. So let me share my screen. You should be seeing now something black, and then now hopefully my screen has come up. Let's see. There you are. So my presentation focuses, takes the starting point of an environmental economist, which I am. So I'm coming at cohesion policy from a different angle, a different path. What I'm going to be talking about today is going to be about promoting the transition toward towards climate neutrality, particularly. And I hope to be highlighting a few lessons learned, a few of the challenges ahead. So in my talk, I would like to touch upon 4 points, basically. First, I would like to state and to remind ourselves of the impacts of climate change and the impacts of climate change policies, just to set the scene. Then I would like to talk a little bit about climate mitigation and carbon neutrality. And particularly, I'd like to focus on 3 of very many crucial aspects. And those 3 are innovation and technological change and the role they have in supporting the transition, demand-side interventions, and finally, equity and just transition considerations. I will then try to show you a couple of a few examples of evidence-based insights from 3 decades of environmental and climate policy making at the international level. And I will close with a few challenges ahead. And in this part, my presentation ties back into cohesion policy and the intersection between green, digital, and the more traditional, let's say, areas of policy making focus for Europe. So let me just go ahead and talk a little bit about the first point of impacts. So I will be rather brief here. And if you would like me to support my statements with other references, I would be happy to do so via email or otherwise. But let me start by saying that in August this year, the 6th assessment report for Working Group 1 of the IPCC was released. This is the first of 3 volumes that assesses the literature around climate change. And this one specifically focuses around the physical basis of the climate change phenomenon. And what the main messages coming out of these reports are, which by the way has been approved by governments, but still needs to be polished and cleaned up for publication. So I took this off the internet, but they may change a little bit until the final report is published later on. The conclusion is that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. Okay, and you can see this very clearly on the graph on the right, where you see observed reddish, let's say, climate change and mean global temperature changes over time, and the green one, the flat one, that would be the simulated one we would have had had the human beings not walked on Earth, basically. Okay, so this gap, this wedge, is our contribution to the changing climate. And what is interesting here is these scientists assess the physical basis. They don't talk about policies. They don't talk about other aspects which are in the realm of Working Group 2 and Working Group 3. But statement D1 from the summary for policymakers of this report states that from a physical science perspective, so from the hard science perspective, limiting human-induced global warming to a specific level requires limiting cumulative emission and reaching net zero. Okay, and here is where the grounding of a lot of actions by government towards proposing decarbonization actually is. There is very clear evidence the climate is too warm, the stakes are too high, we're going to lose a lot of money if we keep on walking along the path that we've been walked so far. And this will materialize basically through negative environmental, health, economic, and social impacts. So climate change means more extreme events. It means harder productivity or more difficult to produce food in the agricultural sector. It means losses. It means human and economic stress on our systems. And so what is interesting, well, what is said on top of this bad news is that these impacts are going to be borne particularly by vulnerable people in the world, across the world, and within each region, the ones who will suffer more from heat waves, from climate damages, are those who are already vulnerable now, both within countries and across countries. So doing nothing is clearly not a good response right now. We have to do something to mitigate climate change and the potential impacts. Now, there's another side to this coin, which is as soon as we start mitigating climate impacts, it means we have to reduce emissions. You see the difference in the wedge here between the dark, let's say, purple and the lighter shades of pink in the graph. It means we have to completely change our production and consumption systems. And this is costly and it will have consequences. So mitigating climate change also will have important costs for society. We will let go of certain damages, but we will have to devote resources to refocusing and restructuring our economy. And also in this case, as it generally usually is, the ones who are going to be in a worse position are the most vulnerable people. So whether we go for climate change or whether we go for mitigation, we do have to pay attention to the distributional impacts of our acts. This has been true, I would argue, it's usually true for all policy making where we change things, but at this point we are talking about impacts of a size which is really, really considerable. These are not marginal impacts on livelihood, livelihood and on societies. So, which brings us to the point that if we really want to go for carbon neutrality, we need to get a lot of things right. And on top of getting, and these include changing the established approach to the provision of goods and services, which is very expensive per se, promoting circular demand, but also carefully, very carefully considering any adverse impacts of climate action and try to understand how to compensate for those. This is important from an ethical point of view, but even if you do not buy into the ethics and you buy into the politics of the process, if you do not have the support of people, you will get a lot of examples of gilets jaunes in very many other countries when we start taxing the things that they cannot use because they are polluting. So now let me move on to climate mitigation and carbon neutrality. The transition towards climate neutrality has an infinite number of components. I am going, for the sake of time, to focus only on 3 of them, the ones that I can more easily speak to, given my experience. And the 3 are the role of innovation and technological change, the importance of demand-side measures, and the focus on just transition and compensations for losers out of this process. With respect to innovation, let me just say that there is ample evidence, both on the ground from practitioners and in theory and empirical papers. The best available low or no carbon technologies are not currently diffused enough. Sorry, there is a not missing in my sentence, are not currently diffused enough to achieve deep emission reductions. So what we have on the table is not enough to do what we have to do. On top of this, if we increase the best available technology deployment, we still will not make it. We will need novel market technologies with high emission potential, and many of these are not currently at commercial stage of development. So we will need a significant effort in innovation, a significant mobilization of funds and of people and of brains and of manpower. Now, experiences teaches us that this can be achieved through a rich and tailored portfolio of policies which promote innovation. These include both pricing and non-pricing policies for carbon. So a carbon tax is not enough. What we've learned from the European experience of the EU ETS is that putting a price on carbon in whichever way or form is not enough to stimulate innovation. You need other supporting policies. There is also another important question which was mentioned in the talk before mine, which is there are a number of other megatrends which will influence our ability to decarbonize, and digitalization is among the first one of those. So let me spend a few minutes, just a couple of minutes, to just tell you how I see the impact of digitalization on decarbonization. If we think about the 3 most hard to decarbonize sectors right now in Europe, And these are the sectors on which the Commission is focusing right now, because electricity, we've done some over the past 2 decades, but industry, mobility, and buildings, we're lagging behind. I mean, we are ahead of the curve, but we're still very behind from where we need to be. And so how can digitalization impact the decarbonization in these 3 sectors? So first of all, as it was mentioned before, digital technology use energy, so they consume energy, they increase demand, and if that demand is provided by fossil fuels, it means there is a direct impact, positive impact on CO2 emissions. They also increase efficiency. This was also mentioned before, smart grids, better use of energy in buildings. This is increased efficiency. And to be honest, the literature right now gives you no clear indication of which one of these 2 is going to prevail on the other. Because if you think about energy efficiency improvements and then you think about population growth and the diffusion of cell phones in fast developing countries, then you see the 2 different forces at work here. Now, I would, my thesis, my starting point is that this is only a small part of how digitalization is intertwined with decarbonization. There are other equally important parts that have not been assessed so far in the literature. And these are competitiveness. Digitalization will impact competitiveness, and by impacting competitiveness, it will mean that it will allow us to be more drastic or less drastic in decarbonization policies. If I try to move away from CO2 emission sectors into novel sectors, but I do not train the workforce for a digital future, then it means that they lose twice. They lose out of what they have now, and they lose out of what they could have had had they been trained in the forward-looking and fast-developing sector per se. The same thing for jobs. We need to be careful on what we propose in terms of reskilling out of high carbon intensity industries for workers. Finally, there is also another crucial aspect that has to do with inequality and governance. Digitalization so far has had the impact of increasing the inequality within countries. So all the things that were mentioned before, we witness in our everyday life. And I'm glad for those communities who had 30% of pupils sitting out, because in my specific neighborhood, we had 70% not being able to reach a digital classroom or more. Out of 10 kids, 7 cannot attend because they don't have the means, or they have too little means for the number of children that they have. So governance here is also crucial, as it was said before. Digitalization is something that can work for humanity, or potentially could work against humanity in very several ways. This is important from the point of view of energy provision. If you have smart grids and an hacker, then you end up with no electricity. And this has happened a few years ago in Rome, for instance, or in Italy. There was a huge blackout, and the whole country was stuck for a day. So this is the role that the innovation can play, and how digitalization and decarbonization are intertwined, which is much deeper than purely technological synergies or barriers, let's say, at least in my opinion. Now on to the second point, which is demand-side interventions. I'm not going to be speaking a lot about this, but I wanted to put up this slide for a reason. The reason is, if you think, or if we all think that we can solve climate through technology alone, we are wrong. It's not going to be enough. You need to act on the demand. You need to be more conservative in the way you use energy. You need to be less wasteful. All of us need to be less wasteful. And this is important to the very least 3 reasons. Number one, demand-side interventions change the preferences of consumers, their utility functions, and they ensure that technological solutions are sustained over time. So you avoid rebound effects. You avoid overusing of resources, which all of a sudden become very cheap. They also, the demand-side interventions are also very important, because climate change is one of 17 challenges on the way towards sustainable development, to the very least. And if you want to have clean water, and if you want to have life on Earth and life in the sea and whatever not, you need to be careful about the use of other resources, non-energy related. Now let me move on to the last point that I wanted to touch here, which is just transition. I'm just going to put on a quote from the Paris Agreement here, and then to note that leaving no one behind, as it's been mentioned before, has been a crucial aspect of the EU Green Deal, Next Generation EU, and all planned future actions currently on the table. So this is something we need to worry about, generally speaking, globally, but also more locally in our region of the world. Now, I would like to just give you a few examples of evidence-based insights from 3 decades of environmental and climate policy. So to do this, I will source from a systematic review effort that some colleagues and I published early this year. It's a systematic review of the literature. To make it very short, what we do here is we look at peer-reviewed literature in the last 20, 25 years, 30 years. These evaluations are of different types. They are applied studies, they are case studies, they are evaluations, they are theoretical studies, they are modeling studies. And we try to see how a given policy instrument, which has been used to implement climate change mitigation, impacts on several outcomes of interest. So very briefly here to help you read the graph, you don't need to read it all. So looking at the first one, building codes, okay, how have they impacted environmental effectiveness? Have they been successful? Have they been successful in promoting competitiveness, in promoting technological change? What was their impact on distribution, on the distribution of resources? Did they increase inequality? And so on and so forth. Did they increase innovation or did they decrease innovation? So this is an effort that has been put in place in order to try and find a way to evaluate and to learn from what has been said in a multi-criteria setting, right? By not wasting what has been found by others, but sort of capitalizing on it. So here I will give you an example of trade-offs. Here, each of the circles tells you for a given policy instrument whether they had a positive impact, blue, and a null impact, not discernible impact, gray, or a negative impact on a specific outcome. On the left, you see competitiveness. On the right, you see distributional. So the literature reports both positive and negative impacts. This is not correlated to the method applied in the single studies. It's not that you get one answer if you do the theoretical study and another answer if you do the case study and yet another one if you do the empirical study. We need to dig deeper. And this is true for every single policy instrument with respect to every single outcome that you can consider, right? So here we propose, and I'm going to be very brief on describing this, we propose a synthetic indicator that tries to summarize the trade-offs between the different outcomes for each of the policy instrument, okay? The bigger the area, the more agreement there is on a specific result, and the results are indicated by the color. Blue means it's a positive impact, red means it's a negative impact. What did we learn from this exercise? We learned that in order to overcome trade-offs, there are very specific policy design features that need to be in place. And so you need to go deeper than the single case study and highlight these commonalities across papers. So for deployment subsidies, for instance, they work if they're tailor-made and if they're predictable and if the level of support for renewable is adjustable over time. Otherwise, they don't seem to be working. Recycling mechanism for taxes and the important role of tax exemptions. R&D funding, very important to have stepped R&D grants rather than simple grants, and so on and so forth. I'm going to move fast, but I'd be happy to go over any other, let's say, detail. In terms of summarizing what we learned from this work is if design is adjustable, flexible, and such that it reflects local conditions and specificities, policies are successful in promoting the transition towards a low carbon neutrality. Different instruments need to be used as part of a portfolio. No single instrument can achieve the goal by itself. Timing of the use of different policy instruments is crucial. Sometimes using market-based instrument too early when you're not ready means that you're going to get it not as good as you could have had had you imposed the limit. And this is something that comes out from a work in progress with co-authors. Overall, there is an underestimation of technological progress coming both from experts and from models, and this needs to be taken into account in order to really target our intervention. Lastly, let me conclude with very briefly with a few challenges ahead. Here you see a picture we looked at when the EU Green Deal came out, which places the just transition mechanism at the heart of the investment strategy and somehow overlapping with the EU budget, InvestEU guarantee, and and all these different components. And for us climate economists, it was very, very interesting because all of a sudden we had to learn all the inner workings of the multi-annual financial frameworks, to which I can answer questions by now, 3 months into reading the documents and not. But it was something we didn't used to worry so much before. I think we should worry about this more. And some of the challenges that I see here are the following. How can we effectively use cohesion policy instruments and approaches to support the transition towards climate neutrality, of course, in the context of a digital economy, increasingly digital economy? What did we learn about the cooperation of governments at different scales, European, regional, national, local? This is very important for climate change because right now we have targets at the nation level, but we need to trickle those down to the municipality level and take action from below if we want to be successful. Can structural funds successfully promote green infrastructure? What will this imply for currently planned investments, some of which are very carbon intensive, for instance, highways and other things? Can we learn from the implementation of climate policies, and when directing the focus of cohesion policies intervention in the EU towards supporting climate neutrality? Basically, what can we learn from climate policy that can be useful in reshaping or embedding this green dimension and this digital dimension into EU cohesion policy? And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't go too much over my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elena. I'm very lucky. We have very disciplined, self-disciplined speakers that speak very effectively for the limited time that is allocated to each of you. What I learned from your very interesting presentation is, the keywords for me are trade-offs and demand-side intervention, which is also essential, and many more. Let me give the floor to Andrés Rodríguez-Pose. Please, Andrés.
Thank you very much, Carlo. And following Werner's suggestion, I have unmuted myself. I'm going to try to be disciplined. I got my timer here right in front of me. And I have been diligent because Ricardo said I should present some slides. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully I'll be able to deal with everything within the time allocated. So let me just start very quickly by saying that, well, we have had one of the biggest challenges we could ever experience. So I don't think that any of us would ever thought that we were going to be dealing with a pandemic in the way we have dealt. That's something we thought had been long gone, and it was a question of the 19th century or even the Great Flu of 1918 has changed our lives. But this big challenge in Europe has been met by this sort of, I don't want to use the word big bazooka, but the Mario Draghi's type, whatever it takes sort of intervention by, in this case, the European Union, in which 806 billion, so a mind-boggling amount of money is going to be spent to transform our societies, not just to emerge as stronger from the pandemic, but also to transform European economies and societies, perhaps in a less bombastic way than with the Lisbon strategy. We're not longer, but making sure that we meet the global challenges that we are facing. And this is going to be done by, and I have highlighted in red the two most important ones: going green, getting the target of being completely carbon neutral by 2050, going digital with a much more efficient use of artificial intelligence, more secure internet shopping, etc., and going healthier, becoming more resilient, and going more and more equal. So this is a big challenge, and there's a lot of money to be invested in a very limited amount of time. But that creates a problem. And the problem is that when you want to go green and when you want to go digital, you're mostly investing in capital intensive activities, which are fundamental, are necessary. We need to, this is a global challenge. We need to transform our societies. But, and these are, as Elena has clearly said, there are ones that are going to affect the most vulnerable. But this is there's a transition period, and these capital intensive activities are very often at the expense of labor intensive activities. So we are going to have a serious problem that comes on the back of a deep and ongoing transformation already of our economic system and of our societies as a result. We were already 20 years, 25 years, 30 years before the pandemic undergoing this transition between an old and a new economy. And a transition that has significant implications. You're going to put an example. 50 years ago, the second largest firm in the world, which was General Motors, had 800,000 workers working in 119 plants in the US, but also in plants in 24 other countries. And most of these plants were scattered around a large geography. They were in, of course, the big centers in Detroit, but you had plants in medium-sized cities, in towns, in some in rural areas. And this sort of activity brought a large number of firms. General Motors had 39,000 firms that were supplying services and goods to the company. And upstream suppliers were paid almost 50% of the revenues received by the company. So in terms of its social and its geographical impact, across the Western world, that's where it was mostly established, although it had plants in developing countries, what you had was the situation in which General Motors had a really broad impact on the economy. The new economic firms, some of which are going to benefit enormously from digitalization, are a very different animal. Let's take a look at Facebook 50 years later, Facebook in 2019, which was the 6th largest company in the world by market value then. But in contrast to the 800,000 direct jobs that GM had and the many indirect jobs, it had less than 40,000 workers working for it. Mostly concentrated in the headquarters in the Bay Area, the headquarters of Menlo Park in the Bay Area, and less than 8,000 workers outside the US. So much more concentration, very high skilled workers, but a very small number, with an average profit that was 53 times higher than in GM in constant dollars. In terms of spillovers and geographical spillovers, the impact is much lower because they can reach directly consumers. So the spillovers are highly, highly limited. The same applies to retail. One of the objectives is we want more secure retail. We want to push people to become more literate to buy online, which is fine. This is what I've been doing for the last 25 years, and I see a lot of benefits, but we have to be careful as well in terms of the transition, because European retail for the EU in 2019 employed 15% of the workforce, both in small retail, but also wholesale retail. And that represented in numbers 32.3 million. These are being, to a large extent, replaced by Amazon. So you just have to walk through any of our cities to see the number of shops that are left empty, what my colleague Richard Florida is calling the retail apocalypse, that have been massively accelerated by the pandemic. And Amazon in 2019 had just 800,000 workers. It has grown rapidly. So today we are, according to the figures that I got from the company's website, at 1.3 million. But you compare 1.3 million for the whole world versus 32 million in retail just in Europe. And the annual revenue growth rate in recent years was 21% in 2019, 38% in 2020, with a profit growth of 84% in 2020, profits that have tripled in the first quarter of 2021, when the growth of retail has been negative, and that the growth has accelerated, negative growth has accelerated in the pandemic. So we're going to have a rough transition. And to get Elena's words, we need to go green, and of course we need to go digital, because in the long run, it's the most vulnerable that are going to lose. But we're going to have a transition in which the most vulnerable are going to lose. And this has two different time horizons that very often are difficult to reconcile. And the question is that this is going to create problems. So if we go green and if we go digital, is this bad? No, it's actually very good. Like in all other technological revolutions, in the end, they have created much more employment than they have destroyed. But the transition period is going to be hard, and we expected that transition before the pandemic to take over place over a number of decades. But 2020, March in Europe, we shut down completely. Here comes the pandemic. And what we find is that overnight, and this is something that Werner has stressed, we go from shopping in shops to a massive shift overnight to online. I mean, many of us were doing it before, but this has been a big revolution from working in offices, and hopefully some of us are going back to the office sooner or later, to having an overnight transition to going digital in many cases, although with a large number of people being left behind, and very often from socializing in person to socializing online. And the problem is that we are getting this sort of situations. This is a city in England in 2020 in which you can see a lot of retail space being boarded up. And it is not London, where, by the way, there was significant boarding up in the city center. You have offices and office space that was empty for a long time, and now with a return to the office, but in, let's say, mixed systems of remote working and working at the office, we're going to need probably in the short term less office space. And if you have less retail space or need for retail space for office space, that's going to affect leisure, and that's going also to affect the use of, let's say, housing in city centers. So this is going to have this rapid transition, significant and important consequences. The most important, and this is where the crux lies, because whether we achieve our goals is going to depend on how well we do the transition. We talk about a lot of just transitions, but in fact, the transitions is anything but just, and the measures that have been put in place are anything but capable of dealing with that. We're talking about what's going to happen in 2050, and which is absolutely necessary, but what is going to happen in 2 years down the line when we have elections for the French government, for example. And the main consequences are going to be the rise of inequality, and who bears the brunt during this transition. Inequality is rising. We have a large number of growing well, not large number, small number, but a bigger number of fat cats, and growing inequality, which is fundamentally not just affecting, as it was before, the ones at the bottom of the pyramid, the lower classes, but is affecting the middle classes. Going digital is great, but the digitalization these days is mostly affecting people that were middle class and are now moving to the lower ranks of the lower middle class, and in some cases would verge in poverty. Together with the interpersonal inequality, what we have is a rise of interterritorial inequality, in which probably the ones that are going to, if you look at data, this is our data that had been compiled by the OECD just last year, but we have significant levels of inequality in Europe, with the rich areas concentrated around the Alps and in big cities. Central and Eastern Europe, much worse. Big cities doing better than intermediate cities, and rural areas doing generally worse. But these are also areas that are going to, in general, are less prepared, far less prepared to confront this digital transition, especially during the transition period. If we just look at this, and well, I still got 9 minutes, but nevertheless, I'm wary of the time, and it would be nice to have a debate. What we have here is that for every single country in the OECD, the rural areas have got a much lower capacity of jobs that can make this transition in the short term towards the digital. By contrast, it is the cities and the big cities that are at the forefront, and the towns and semi-dense areas are somewhere in between. And there's also a gap not just across countries. It's much worse if you are in Turkey, if you're in Bulgaria, if you're in Romania, if you are, for example, in Spain, and you're much more dependent on tourism. But within those countries, what we find is at the top is places like London, like Stockholm, like Copenhagen, like Paris, like, for example, Athens, like Vienna, that are the ones where 50% of the population, in some cases more, but in all cases, virtually all cases, more than 40% can make the transition of workers to working digital almost overnight. If you are in other parts of the country, if you are, for example, in Chemnitz, and let's see what happens on Sunday in Germany, in East Germany, if you are in the Alentejo in southern Portugal, if you are in Western Croatia, and you depend mainly on contacts with tourists, etc., then, or the Balearic Islands in Spain, which is not particularly a poor region, you're going to have a significant, let's say, conflict that is going to be arising during this transition period. And that is something that we cannot avoid. And I don't think we're putting enough thought into this. And to be frank, I think we're in a worse situation because it's not just raining, it's pouring. So when we take a look at what's happening, and these are, I mean, maps are, they're a work in process because we haven't got good data at the moment or good analysis of interpersonal inequalities across regions in Europe. But if you take a look, the regions that are with the highest levels of inequality in 2018 are places like the north of England that have already rebelled, parts of central and southern France, Croatia, parts of Bulgaria, etc. But these are very often places like the northeast of England, the south of France, the north of France, where inequalities, interpersonal inequalities, have been growing already in places that have been declining for a very, very, very long time. And that is creating a serious problem of discontent that is already there. Elena mentioned the Gilets jaunes, and of course, I would say that the Gilets jaunes, and I agree with her, they will benefit ultimately of this. But if we have this sort of reaction across the whole of Europe, we might not get to the ultimate goal. The transition might kill us. And that's where we have the problem. We have a situation whereby the perception, and sometimes also, and it's not just a question of perception, the reality of who benefits and who loses from these transitions are important. If there's a feeling like it happened with the Gilets jaunes, that we are going to change towards greener systems of transportation, and we need to get rid of diesel, and everyone agrees that we need to get rid of diesel, but the ones that have to pay for the diesel tax are not those making the decisions in Paris that have massive alternatives in terms of public transport, but the people living in Nièvre, in the region of Nièvre, for example, that are people that have seen their alternatives modes of transport disappear, that were told just 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that the best way to invest in terms of transport was to buy diesel cars. And then suddenly they find that the only alternative they have is the one that they're being taxed, and they feel that they're have to pay for something that is driven by others, and they don't see any benefit. We have a big problem. And it's not just the people in La Nièvre, it's a lot of other issues that are being related. So if Werner highlighted, he talked about his mother in the Austrian mountains, if a lot of people feel that they are left behind by moving digital in many sorts of activities without the capacity to actually, or the needs or the means to be able to do that transition, we're going to have with a much more discontented population that is going to go and vote for bigger streams left and right. And that creates a problem, and that creates a serious problem, because this rise of discontent at the moment, that is, to a certain extent, I mean, it's not by any means the only factor, but there are cultural factors and the like, but this perception of the uneven impact of the transitions, of the changes that need to be done in order to meet the pressing global challenges that we're facing are only paid by some people that tend to be already the most vulnerable and living in the most vulnerable and declining places. what we're going to have is that the global objective, or the objective of being carbon neutral by 2050, we're not going to meet, not because we haven't got the capacity or the technical capacity, or we haven't got the ideas to do it. It's because we're not going to be allowed. Because this is a situation that is giving opportunities to parties that have very strong nationalistic, anti-elite and anti-immigrant agendas, that have serious misgivings about economic integration and trade. So they go to the heart of, do we need a European Union at all? So they're strongly Eurosceptic. They have a disdain of scientific progress, and whatever Elena, whatever Werner, or whatever I will say would be completely ignored and disregarded. They couldn't care less about climate change. We know what has happened with 4 years of Donald Trump presidency in the US in that respect. And they are very hostile to important issues regarding equality, like gender equality, and factors like, for example, integrated and tackling climate change. What we'll have is climate deniers in power. So this is, in my case, a word of warning. We need to think big, but not just think big to achieve goals that are extremely serving 10, 15, 20 years down the line. We need to complement them with strong intervention right now. Because if, let's say in 2 years time, we have a Marine Le Pen president of France, and this is something that 15 years ago, we never imagined it would happen. But now it's a distinct possibility. We'll have a Salvini as Prime Minister of Italy, and we'll have, we don't need any more, just those two. That would mean that any chance of greening and digitalizing our economy, any chance of becoming more competitive and more inclusive 30 years down the line, we'll have to kiss goodbye, because we'll have a society that would have far stronger problems immediately, just because we have overlooked what should have been a transition that we expected was going to take a long time, and has been dawned upon us by the pandemic in just a matter of days, weeks, if not, well, I would say years, days, if not months, days, if not weeks. Well, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to try to discuss any sort of issues that you all have.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Let me get to the chat. I mean, the conversation is open. You can, anybody listening to the presentation or joining the discussion here can ask questions. I myself have many different questions. I was, and my mood has been changing over the last hour, starting with Werner and his, call for what we need, what we want, how we want to transform our economies, and then Elena started talking about trade-offs and careful, digital and green. We would like them to go together, but sometimes, or many often, they don't. And Andrés finally warns us that if something happens. I mean, I remember watching years and years the BBC series a couple of years ago, and was somehow imagining what would happen in a few years. That would be very hard to imagine, and then suddenly these things happen, and our desire to move towards a greener and more digital society just blast. So let me see, we have one question. The audience cannot pose questions, but with the chat, right? Okay, let me ask one question that is that has been coming up in previous sessions as well. That is constantly behind the kind of conversations we have on these matters. That refers to the institutional quality. In the keynote speakers session this morning, there was a discussion that was raised by Henry Overman and many others, saying, substantial research is stressing the fact that institutional quality is behind economic development, is behind inclusion, is behind effective processes of transformation. And then we all know what it is. We often find it hard to measure exactly what that is, and we know very little on how to improve it and what to do. So there's a big question on what to do to improve institutional quality. And given that this is likely to affect all the things we're discussing here. And the second question related to that is that there is an inherent paradox. There's a chicken and egg problem. We would like to have an institutional quality to put in place the policies we desire, but we don't have the institutional quality, especially in the regions and locations and countries that would need them most forcefully. So what do we do? What is the right timing and what is the right approach in this? So I don't know whether you want to comment something on institutional quality and how we move ahead this issue while we gather more questions. Andrés, please, and yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Carlo. I think that institutional quality is absolutely crucial in this respect. In order to do the transitions that we need to do, we need better institutions. And of course, you raised the question first, how do we define institutions? How do we measure institutions? And what do we do? Which are still big questions in the air. But I say that we are getting better at defining institutions in terms of, before we just focus mostly on formal institutions. Now, increasingly, we're focusing on informal institutions, going from the quality of government, the rule of law, the protection of private property, to issues like, for example, corruption and social capital and the like. And we are now far better at measuring that, and we have long-time series that are plausible. The work that has been done by the Gothenburg Institute, University of Gothenburg, of Quality of Government at the behest of the European Commission has been amazing in this respect. And at subnational level, we are now much better at measuring institutions. What can be done? Of course, it depends from one country to the other. The problems vary enormously. In some countries, we don't need to make them. Austria, for example, the Nordic countries, we don't need to do much in terms of improving institutions, but in other countries and the Eastern and Southern Rim, there's a need to make a lot. How can we do that? I mean, capacity building is an obvious answer. Promoting the mobility of people to learn from best practices is one. We're promoting very much through Erasmus the mobility of the young people, and this is great. But although there are schemes to do it, we need to promote the mobility of civil servants just to generate innovation and bring best practices into areas where there are institutional problems. We need to also reward institutional best practices and promote those ideas. We also need to make sure that all these elements appear in intervention, because until now, what we have been focusing has been about the big issues, but the institutional deficiencies are the spanner in the works that prevents many of the policies, where they are innovation policies or skill policies, or, for example, green transition and digitization policies, that very often limit the capacity of many places in Europe to actually make a leap forward and go beyond the current bottleneck into a new system in which they can actually deliver better quality of life for the people that live there.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrés. Elena, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Andrés covered a whole lot of it. I think that the important thing, I mean, to me, what is striking is that institutions and good institutions and good governance, although I am an economist, so I will be lightly on that, you know, I walk lightly on that thread, they emerge through processes. So I think an important topic here is that we do not just need to talk about justice from the distributional point of view, which is linked to money, but we need to talk about justice from the procedural point of view and the involvement of people and the involvement of citizens and institutions per se. So to me, institutions are hard, you know, they are agencies, government, but they're also soft, they're rules, they're things that we don't see. And I think that in this respect, Europe has worked a lot, not Europe as the European Commission, but the idea, the vision of Europe has worked a lot behind the scenes in getting us all close together. Of course, this is a very slow process, which is the problem here. We don't have a lot of time. A lot of these things will happen fast, whether we like it or not. Digitalization, because it's creeping on its own at a, you know, a very, very high velocity, and climate, because it's just happening very, very fast. So there is clearly a trade-off. I would suggest that on top of worrying, you know, we are throwing a lot of money at a lot of countries, and some of those will not be able to use them efficiently, I think. And so it's really crucial that we work on the other aspect, as you said, capacity building, also through involvement of the citizens, so that they can buy into these transitions. Whichever way we go, they feel like they're a part of it and they're not left out from decision making. And I think that the idea of this consultation that Europe does, I would be really curious to know how many people, you know, what's the percentage of Europeans that actually contributes to this stakeholder, stakeholder provision of ideas. And of course, this is a super challenging question. So it's just one aspect of the answer.
Thank you, Elena. Werner, I see you would like to say something, please.
Yes, indeed. And well, in the area of spending, it's already obvious how important the quality, the capacity of authorities is to pull this off. And I mentioned that we are now talking about the next generation of spending, multi-country projects, complex combinations of different sources of finances, and so on and so forth. But I want to stress another aspect of capacity building in the digital field, which we're discussing on all the legislative files. I did not speak about those in my intervention, but we are always coming back to the same question. I mentioned democratic control, but you also need to be able to have the capacity as an administration actually to regain the democratic control from the large gatekeeper platforms, if you want. Because one of our observations was that we have privatized markets in a way. We have those, those marketplaces, whether it's Amazon, whether it's the App Store or Google Play Store, whether it's the large hotel booking platforms, whether it is any of the large platforms, they have created markets on which everybody depends. Everybody uses them. It's good and it's bad. I mean, I could speak for hours on that, but still, it is sort of privately owned companies that have created markets on which everybody else depends, that are unilaterally deciding the rules of the game, that often compete on the very same marketplaces with those that depend on those marketplaces, and all of that in opacity, because they control the algorithms. Now, what we are doing with our legislation is to regain control, and we're saying, no, there's clear rules, how these platforms can operate. A lot of this is linked to transparency. A lot of it is opening up to a certain extent, for instance, algorithms. Wonderful. But now just imagine, even today, authorities find it difficult to spend money wisely. In the future, they would have to see to what extent artificial intelligence employed by company X risks creating discrimination against this, that, or the other group, So we're creating new powers, thank God, for public bodies and authorities to oversee the digital transformation. But you've got to build the resources to be able of doing so.
Thank you very much. We have three very interesting questions from the floor. I guess all of you can try to answer, but let me tell you exactly what it is. I mean, this one mainly for Andrés, talking about noticing the inexorable trend towards shrinking of the overall volume of available work and jobs, and asking whether you think universal unconditional income would help the digital transition, let me add the two additional questions we have here. The next one is on incentives, and what incentives you see could help and induce those losing from the transition, places and people, to be active part of it and be engaged in a transition. And thirdly, a question on SMEs. I mean, we see that there's a digital divide and there's a big gaps in acquiring and using technologies and transiting towards digital and green technologies. And this appears to be especially strong for SME, for small and medium-sized enterprises. And they're wondering whether the Commission is envisaging to target some of these structural barriers at the firm level and especially promote SMEs in this effort. That's all for the moment. Three big questions. Who wants to start? Universal and unconditional income.
If I can start on the first two that come together, and thank you very much, Dimitris and Claire, for your questions that I'm going to link like Carlo made. I'm very skeptical of universal incomes, universal unconditional incomes, as a solution to this problem. I'm not very skeptical. I'm completely against. Why? Because I don't think that's the solution. First, because we have, in a hidden way, we haven't done an unconditional income support in Europe, apart from very few pilots in Finland, and it was discontinued. But in other ways, in different forms of ways, in comparison to, for example, the United States, in Europe, we have subsidized our population for a much, much longer period. In places where have been losing and have been declining, thinking about the south of Italy, for example, that has been subsidized for the best of 60, 70 years. In the UK, we have a more individual level, third generations of people that have been living on welfare. And we have places like, for example, the south of France, not in the south of France, sorry, the island of Corsica, in which what we have had is we have more than 50% of the working population working in the public sector and at the highest level of subsidies, or one of the highest levels of subsidies in continental France. And the question is, are these people happy? And no, it hasn't raised discontent because they realized that handouts is not the future. They want jobs. This goes back to my youth, when people that were being made redundant in the shipyards in Spain were coming out with banners saying, we want real jobs. And we want real jobs for them meant, and they say, we don't want to be waiters and we don't want to be civil servants. And I am a civil servant. So they want jobs. But of course, national governments or the European Union is not here to provide jobs to people like that, but to help create the right ecosystems in which job opportunities can thrive, which at the moment in many places they have been overlooked because it was considered that it was better to do that in more dynamic places, and then therefore the welfare would spread, which is not. And this implies working much more, for example, on skills. It's completely logical in a country like Spain or in Portugal in the past that while they were investing heavily, for example, in infrastructure, and now we're going to go to all these transitions, they were overlooking the fact that 1/3 of the young were leaving high school without qualifications, were high school dropouts. We need to do much more on lifelong learning, in which we do very, very little. We need to do much more on innovation. There's this idea, why don't we go for big missions and big projects? So the whole ideas that are being promoted by Mazzucato and adopted by the Commission, which is all very good. But the problem is that most innovation in SMEs, that's the next question that comes afterwards, most innovation in areas, in medium-sized cities and areas that have been lagging behind, comes from incremental product and process innovation, organizational innovation, and there's very little that has been done in that respect. And of course, we have already talked about dealing with institutional problems that are at the heart of lack of economic dynamism, but also huge discontent. And this goes to the chicken and egg sort of issue. I don't care about the chicken and egg. I want eggs and I want the chicken. And we need to do both at the same time. So in order to do those issues, what we need is probably to create the conditions that will facilitate that the right ecosystems arise for the talent and the talent that is spread everywhere in Europe is actually harnessed and mobilized. Because at the moment, what many of these people fear of is not just the lack of attention, but also the lack of services, and especially the lack of opportunities, just on the basis that you're born in the wrong place, and therefore you cannot do it. So in short, we need other types of incentives, but I don't think that the universal income is the solution in any way or form.
Right. There was another question on SMEs and whether the Commission is doing something specifically for them in this context.
Well, yes, of course, is the short answer, as difficult as it is, because there is hundreds of thousands of SMEs out there, and even with the most ambitious of policies, it's always very hard to have real impact on the ground. There have been SME strategies as long as I can think of, also at the beginning of this mandate. Now, with the digital transition in particular, I think there are a few things that are more targeted towards onboarding them in a way, you know, investing in digital innovation hubs, bringing technology to the SMEs, bringing the data economy to the SMEs. Sometimes when it comes to new technologies, provide them with regulatory sandboxes so that they can experiment if you're a startup or something. But then also there's the more general policies that are obviously the horizontal policies also meant to support SMEs. If we invest in digital skills of the whole workforce and population, obviously that is meant to help SMEs as much as anybody else. In terms of connectivity, when we say we want gigabit up and download speeds everywhere, also on the countryside in more remote areas, when there's so many SMEs that are not in the urban areas, that obviously would depend greatly on such connectivity. But last but and certainly not least, when I talked about the regulatory framework, so many small companies and independent people sell and offer stuff through digital platforms. This is the new way of doing business, and COVID has accelerated this further, right? If you were not able to offer your goods and services online, you were very unlikely to survive here. And that's everybody from a small shop that sells on a marketplace. When I was a child, an Austrian company, a small SME, couldn't have sold to anywhere else in Europe. Now, jumping on eBay or Amazon or what have you, they on average sell to 7-9 other countries. Small independent people, interior designers would do marketing on Instagram and all of a sudden find customers through this channel as much as you do on Facebook, as much as a small hotel does on booking.com. Yeah, I would never have found a small Portuguese hotel when I was young. Now I can find them if I'm looking for them. But the dependency on those platforms with all the market power imbalances just means that we need to protect them better. And that is what our legislation is doing. It strengthens the weaker party that depends on a much stronger party and partially competes with that much stronger party. This is absolutely important. In the past, we always said consumer policy means a consumer is weaker than a company. Fine. But we are in the next phase now where a normal company is so much weaker than the very, very large companies that we have seen in the digital world. So they need almost equal protection than in the old days consumers needed vis-a-vis companies.
Thank you very much. There's still a little time for additional comments and questions from the audience. There was a comment that I like very much on the role of educational systems and the need to think big and think in terms of how educational systems help us address these problems. Then there's another question, if perhaps you want to address it quickly, on how to embrace sectoral structures of countries on the less developed part of Europe. How can you introduce technological progress in regions which are not hubs in international value chains? You want to say just a statement or something?
I mean, if it's the question is a big question, and we don't have a whole lot of time to comment on it. But I think that the importance of technological cooperation, of these hubs and sandboxes that we're talking about before, that are not only relevant for digital, they are relevant for all types of technologies, especially in line with the transition. And let me just leave it at that, I think, because I think the session is going to be closing soon, and
yeah.
We can follow the conversation offline if needed.
Thank you very much. We academics typically end up this kind of conversation saying, there's still a lot to research on. We still have big questions to tackle ahead, and this is definitely the case. I mean, we've been talking about a number of different things, all of them very urgent and very stringent, and where we are facing a period where there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of political determination. At the same time, there's an extreme urgency in tackling all these issues. And there's huge trade-offs wherever we look at. There's the green versus digital, or the digital expanding the divide and the differences, and friends here hoping that not everything is becoming digital, because what will do our parents and grandparents? It's the feeling left out. So let me conclude this session with a tone of hope and desire to further think and contribute to this discussion. We'll find additional ways to contribute. And we're happy that the European Commission is also listening and ready to engage and think about how best to find the appropriate policies and the different levels of intervention and the different domains that need to be addressed. We have a concluding panel at 4:20, so we have a little time for tea or coffee. And we'll meet in a little while. And thank you very much to the speakers and to the audience for the interesting questions. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.